Thank you for joining us on Heritage Events Live. We welcome you to Grim Prospects for Women and Girls in Afghanistan. Please welcome our host, Nicole Robinson, Research Associate on the Middle East for the Allison Center for Foreign Policy. We hope you enjoy the program.
Good morning, everyone. A few housekeeping notes to get out of the way before we begin. The session is recorded and will be emailed to you and posted on the Heritage website within 48 hours. All attendees are in listen-only mode, and you can submit your questions in the chat box. When you do send those questions, please let me know your name and the organization you are affiliated with. First, I wanted to thank the audience for taking the time to listen in today. I'm honored to be joined by such a distinguished lineup of panelists to discuss a very somber but critical subject that has made news headlines over the last few weeks, which is, of course, the situation in Afghanistan. It's been really heartbreaking watching Afghan families, many who put their lives on the line to help the US, desperately trying to flee from Taliban rule. With the evacuations deadline set to expire today, many Americans and Afghans alike fear what life will be like under the Taliban, especially women and girls. The Taliban has an extensive track record of abuse of women's rights, and there's nothing to indicate that they have changed since the 1990s. Unfortunately, it is likely that many of the tremendous gains and hard-won freedoms that women and girls enjoyed in the past 20 years will not survive Taliban rule. To walk us through the impact of these recent developments in Afghanistan, we have, and I ask that our panelists turn on their cameras and their microphones as well. We have Ambassador Roya Rahmani, who was just named a Distinguished Fellow at my alma mater, Georgetown University, and previously served as Afghanistan's first female ambassador to the United States from December 2018 to July 2021. I'm so happy that you can join us today, Ambassador.
Thank you.
We are also joined by Hila Najibullah, who's on the phone today. She's a conflict and peace researcher and the author of the book Reconciliation and Social Healing in Afghanistan, which analyzes the Afghan reconciliation process in 1986 and 2010. Thank you, Hila, for joining us today as well.
Thank you for having me. I'm sorry, because of technical reasons, I cannot turn my camera on. Glad to be with you.
Thank you. And then finally, we have with us today Lisa Curtis, who is a senior fellow and director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. She served most recently as Deputy Assistant to the President and the Senior Director for South and Central Asia at the National Security Council. And she's also a Heritage alum. Welcome back, Lisa.
Thank you for having me.
So today's event will be a conversation in two parts. First, we will hear from the panelists, and then we're going to take about 15 minutes to take questions from the audience as well. So again, thank you all for joining us today, as well as the panelists. I wanted to direct my first question to Ambassador Rahmani. In your opinion, how have the rights of Afghan women evolved over the years, and how do you think it will be affected by Taliban rule? And then also, in your experiences as ambassador, how have you helped promote the rights of Afghan women?
Thank you. The international community's biggest and most tangible achievement was the progress of women that was achieved over the past 20 years. Yet the most fragile one at the same time. Women have made massive progress in the past 20 years. This had direct contribution and relationship with the national security agenda, with the counterterrorism strategies, and economic development, social development, change in the mindsets, and much more. This has been one of the biggest successes that the past 20 years we were able to achieve. However, at this point, yet again, as I mentioned, that this is the most fragile one at the same time, it seems that the women will be those who will be losing the most, whether it is because of conflict or the authoritarian regime that is oppressive towards women. So far, the Taliban have tried to put a more moderate PR face stating that They would allow women to enjoy the rights and liberties that they have had over the past 20 years, with a caveat that it had to be within the Islamic Sharia. Now, that introduction or injection is very loaded, because Afghanistan is a Muslim country, and women of Afghanistan have been practicing Islamic rules and laws all along. To inject that, it basically also means that they would be subjected to the sort of interpretation that we have seen, potentially the kinds of it in the 1990s. And that is a very alarming situation for all Afghan women. What I have been able to do in terms of promotion of women's rights during my work, I would say that prior to working with the Afghan government, I worked with the nonprofit world, where my own focus was mostly on building the capacity, as well as advocacy, supporting the local organizations, so that the civil society would be more sustainable, more self-sufficient, and also to think that way, to be more creative, and to think how they could work sustainably without the international aid, because it was always clear that it would not continue to be at the same level as it was way back in early 2000s. That was where I was mostly focused. Second, as a member of the Afghan government for over the past decades, my focus was also to bring women's rights and women's issues from the margin to the center, to continue to advocate that it should not be looked at as an ethical issue only, or a moral issue, a tick box that would bring nicety and symbolism to the politics, but why it matters tangibly and how it could have a huge impact moving forward. How does it relate to economy? How does it relate to security? How does it relate to social change, defeating extremism and terrorism?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point for our audience, that women's rights is as much as advancing a country's security and stability. They need to be involved at all levels of the government and society. So that's a super important point. Hila, I want to get your opinion on this as well, and your experience as an Afghan woman, looking at the rights of women and how they've evolved over the past 20-ish years, and how you think that it will be affected by Taliban rule now.
Thank you, Nicole. You see, Afghanistan, before the history of Cold War, and also during the Cold War, the women of Afghanistan had their freedoms, they had their engagements in the government, they were people who were active. So it's not only after 2001 that they were liberated. You must understand that during the civil war, when the Mujahideen took over in 92, when the women role was limited according to the Sharia, and then by the Taliban from 96 onward. So in 2001, after the fall of the Twin Towers, the new government was established and they came over. There was almost a renewal of platforms for the Afghan women to re-emerge as the roles that they have had before. I mean, my grandmother used to work as the manager of Kabul Hotel and then later on Ariana Airlines. My mother was the director of a school in the 1980s. So to just put it in perspective, that Afghan women have always been active, have always been very right-centric, and yes, there have been Muslims, but they have had their share of challenges under whatever government or monarchy or regime that they have been. But they have fought, and they fought hard. Unfortunately, with the current circumstances, they seem to, their voices seem to be cut again, and they've been reduced to a minority and second citizens.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I'm glad that you got to share your experience with your mom and your grandmother. And Lisa, I know that you worked previous role you worked at the National Security Council. I'm just curious to know your experiences working on the Afghan peace deal at the time. You know, how you've seen the rights of women evolve over the past couple of years, or what your experience has been working on this issue.
Well, certainly we have seen really tangible advances for women in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. They have more access to health care. They have more access to education. They were in the parliament, young women playing sports. You know, in all respects, women were healthier, more educated, more active participants in the social, political, economic life of the country. And if women's role in the economy shrinks, the overall economic development of the country will suffer. So that is an important point for everyone to keep top of mind. And I think the way in which the Taliban has taken power does not bode well for the future of women. Had there been a power sharing agreement, the Taliban were forced to share power with more moderate political leaders, I think there would have been a better chance to moderate Taliban policies. However, that's not what happened. There was no peace agreement. In fact, the Taliban never really showed an interest in a genuine negotiated political settlement. In fact, they took a page from the insurgent playbook by participating in peace talks merely to gain international legitimacy while continuing to pursue a military path to power. And I think if we look at the violence levels, they went up after the signing of the Doha Agreement. Assassinations of civil society leaders, journalists, including female journalists, human rights activists, actually increased after the signing of the Doha Agreement. So really there was never a genuine peace process that was happening. And in terms of my role, so over the last 20 years, I have always tried to connect for people the connection between women's issues and national security. And I did that in my role at the NSC, a senior director for South and Central Asia, strenuously made the case for women's rights, human rights in general, to be part of any peace agreement, any peace negotiations. I recall in particular a meeting in Doha with the US negotiator Zal Khalilzad. We were meeting with the women peace negotiators, the Afghan women peace negotiators in Doha in the fall of 2020. And the US peace negotiator said, well, women's issues are the second priority for the United States. The first priority is counterterrorism. And I stepped in and I said, actually, that is not my opinion, because women's issues and counterterrorism are directly linked. Because the more repressive the Taliban is toward women, the greater resonance that has with radical ideologies, and that permeates society. Whereas on the flip side, if women are given rights and status within society, that has a tempering effect on radical ideologies that eventually lead to terrorism. So I think, I will continue to make this point. The issues of women and terrorism go hand in hand in Afghanistan. And the direction that women move in Afghanistan will be a major determining factor of whether the country reemerges as a terrorist safe haven.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that often gets misunderstood in negotiation talks. And women are just as part of the conversation as others, and their rights are intrinsically linked to national security of the country. So that's a really important point. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, and I wanted to ask Hila, I saw in your past role you talk a lot about civil society safeguarding the rights of women, and I'm just wondering, what has been the role of civil society to safeguard the rights of women, and then at this point, is there anything that civil society can do, or is there anything that, that civil society can do?
I think the civil society is already doing quite a lot. I mean, only on 28th of August, a lot of Afghan diaspora in almost 22 cities got up and showed their, their solidarity against the coming of the Taliban under the barrel of the gun. They do not agree with the Taliban takeover. We asked and requested the international community not to legitimize the Taliban. We did ask for refugees to be accepted and the borders to be open because they're taking Afghans hostage. I'm very glad that Ms. Curtis is talking about how, during her visit in Doha, Mr. Khalilzad was saying that priority was counterterrorism. But I'm sorry to say that the priority was not even counterterrorism. As we see, ISIS is back in Afghanistan. We did not, throughout the 20 years of US involvement in Afghanistan, you had the head of your intelligence, you had people like Steve Cole and others write out what was the role of the Pakistan, and yet the United States just did not want to admit and accept and deal with the sort of elephant in the room to address the main challenges of the terrorism. So let alone the issues of women's rights or civil society. For 3 years of my advocacy, when I would talk about civil society and women issues during the talks, there was like almost an amusing kind of a face, as if I was joking, that this was not something that was really important. If the Afghan government was isolated during the talks, what could the civil society do? In Afghanistan, despite of all the challenges, on the second day that Taliban come to Kabul, Afghans get up with a demonstration with their flag saying, we do not want you to change our identity. We do not want another flag. We do not want our army to be dissolved and our military equipment go to Pakistan. Yet everybody, including Mr. Khalilzad today, tweets saying it's an issue of Afghans, they can resolve it amongst themselves, while Mr. Qureshi, who is the foreign minister of Pakistan, is going around talking to people how to bring peace. Do you think that peace will be acceptable for Afghans or the civil society? Not at all. So the sad part of this 20 years of US involvement in Afghanistan is the culture of inaccountability. Mr. Biden talks about, I feel zero responsibility. It goes all the way down to Afghanistan, where Mr. Ghani goes and passes on the buck to somebody else. And who pays the price? The Afghans. And this is where we are at, unfortunately. The civil society can only do as much as long as international community, helps them to raise their voice. If the international community legitimizes them, what can the civil society do under the barrel of the gun? Thank you.
Yeah, and I want to get the ambassador's viewpoint on this as well. Do you agree with Hila, and do you have anything to add as well? I'm sorry, I think you're muted.
Yes, absolutely. I definitely agree with the points that Hila raised. Particularly, I would like to pick up from where she left off, and that is that it's the people of Afghanistan that bear the brunt of the miseries, that whether it was during the conflict or now the aftermath of how it is evolving to a new phase. I'm not sure if I can say that the conflict is ending, because we need to see a lot more and what that means. And also war and conflict does not necessarily only mean silencing guns. It is extremely helpful to begin with, of course, but there is so much more to feeling safe and secure, or that definition of human security. Just adding to what Hila was saying, the civil society has a very important role. In fact, I would say that now is a very testing and difficult time for the entire civil society, because many people have left, the politicians left, the people left without much accountability, which is actually one of the major problems of why this happens. And not only in one country, it happens in countries one after another, that leaders can mess up and get away with it and not be accountable to the people and to what they have done, even in terms of their own wrongdoings. But now what happens to civil society really depends on what the international community is willing to do, particularly in terms of keeping access to Afghanistan, with the embassies closing down, with the airports shutting down, with turning a completely blind eye to Afghanistan and abandoning it once again, saying that, okay, now it's your conflict, if you have one, and resolve it by yourself, and whoever is imposing whatever ideology on you, it's all your problem at this point. I don't think the civil society would have much room to function effectively. However, I must also say that the civil society is already, as Hila said, trying to do a lot within and outside Afghanistan. But what's important is within Afghanistan, and that is because they feel the need. They are on the ground. They are the one that are best in touch with the people, and nobody can tell you what they need other than the people who are in need. So they have a very important role, and now more than ever, the civil society needs the support of the international community.
Yeah, thank you. And, Lisa, I wanted to get your perspective on this as well, working with different civil society groups. What do you think it would be the role of the international community with reaching out to these different civil society groups, if there is appetite, if they can safely interact with these groups? What would be the opinion of you?
Well, I agree with Ambassador Rahmani that it is very important for the international community to continue to support the civil society. A lot of these groups have been, funded by the international community, a lot of the NGOs, but not just the NGO community, just the civil society writ large needs the support of the international community. Now, hopefully the Taliban would realize how much the civil society is contributing to making Afghanistan a more productive, vibrant society. But I think right now what we see is they're very nervous, they're very scared, very fearful, staying in their homes, not sure which way the Taliban is going to go with regard to their activities, what they've been doing, especially if they've been working on human rights, women's rights issues. So it's a really uncertain time for the civil society. And let's not forget, as I indicated in my opening remarks, that the Taliban was targeting civil society leaders up until they took power. Just a couple weeks before the Taliban took power, they had assassinated the state media chief in Kabul. So, we need to understand that the Taliban has not been using kid gloves against civil society. They've been targeting them. And we need to see if they're changing those policies and what is going to happen, because so far the track record is very bad, and these people, I think, are scared, and they most certainly need the support of the international community, both in terms of our public statements, but also in terms of our financial assistance, funding, if we can figure out ways to make sure that we're supporting the civil society in particular, I think that is extremely important moving forward.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and that segues to my next question for you, Lisa, actually about this question of international aid. There's been a lot of conversations about whether suspensions should happen of international aid. I know that the IMF suspended Afghanistan's access to its resources and funding, so I'm curious to know your thoughts about, your views about international aid going to Afghanistan now with the Taliban back in power.
Well, I think it's very complicated. Clearly, we don't want a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. There's been a lot of movement of people, a lot of internally displaced people that need food, need shelter. They have immediate basic needs that the international community needs to support. So that humanitarian aid flow must continue. With regard to other longer term financial assistance, you mentioned the IMF has suspended their program, the World Bank has suspended their programming. We need to coordinate with like-minded democratic countries like the UK, EU countries, Japan, India, South Korea, who care about the future of women in the country, who care about the future of the civil society. Russia and China will not be helpful on this issue. So I don't think we can count on them to coordinate closely with the United States. But the other democratic countries, yes, we need to be coordinating now as we speak, how we're going to condition that assistance moving forward. And this has a real impact right now. What we're hearing is that the World Bank funding from the Afghan Reconstruction Trust Fund was going towards supporting the healthcare system. And now that that money's been suspended, healthcare is not being provided. So this needs immediate attention. And this is one way that the international community can have an immediate impact. They can condition that resumption of aid on women getting full access to healthcare, women and girls, female doctors remaining in position, continuing their work. So we could have an immediate impact to help women by conditioning that World Bank funding right now. Now, bilateral aid has also been suspended. So again, the donors are going to have to meet. They're going to have to decide how to move forward, conditioning that assistance not only on human rights, but also on the terrorism issue. And it certainly will be more effective if we're coordinating our policies with other countries. That's been one criticism of the United States in the last couple of years, that it did not coordinate closely, consult closely with our European partners, both on the peace process as well as the withdrawal process. So we need to change that, and the US needs to coordinate our policies toward the Taliban with the international community. Look, the privilege of international recognition by countries like the US and other powerful nations is a big deal. And so we need to use that leverage to try to shape the way the Taliban is going to be treating women, going to be treating the civil society. The Taliban, I think Ambassador Rahmani pointed this out, is saying all the right things. They're on a sort of media campaign, saying the right things, but we're also hearing very negative reports on the ground that women are being forced to stay home. They're not being allowed to get into the university in Herat, that they're being treated very brutally by Taliban fighters. So, we need to continue to monitor what's happening and then condition that assistance on actions that the Taliban actually takes, not just words, but their actions.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it'll be really important to coordinate, as you say, and condition-based aid is definitely a conversation that I've seen in the media lately. Ambassador, I would like to get your opinion on this as well, and just maybe ask a little bit more about what do you think in terms of access, in terms of aid. And places like Yemen, obviously it's been difficult for international organizations to access different parts of Yemen, so I'm curious to know what you think in terms of international aid to Afghanistan, and whether there will be access, and if there isn't, what the international community can do to help those still in Afghanistan.
Thank you. The points that Lisa just raised, I would like to confirm and add to that. That number one, it is very important to have a more coordinated approach towards aid. Second, it is extremely important that moving forward, like you said, that we secure ways to reach Afghanistan and reach the communities that are targeted for the aid. One of the issues with the approaches over the past 20 years in particular has been lack of coordination that Lisa was talking about. But in addition to that, it has been also the focus being very Kabul-centric. It was too much attention to the politicians and how they position themselves, and a very, very centralized approach in the absence of functional institutions which would deliver equally and distribute the aid to all the communities. That contributed to what we are seeing today as a result, and the takeover of the Taliban, grievances, corruption, and much more that all contributed to that. So moving forward, what is very important is to really adapt new approaches, new strategies, reach the communities that are in need, and then make it conditional. Again, as Lisa was saying, it is extremely important to condition the provision of aid, and one of it should be definitely relevant to what we are discussing today, the role of women. It should not be just saying that you have to agree that you will respect the rights of women, or you would allow women to access education or healthcare and whatnot, but you have to ask to be able to see women in public spaces. You have to ask for ensuring that there is connectivity, that there is reach, that the journalists can travel, that women can have access to the media and social media, to ensure that really what you agree and what you sign up for is really happening. So we are looking at these pictures and footages coming from Afghanistan. There are no women in any of these meetings. So when you are already subtracting half of the society and pushing them inside with no certainty about their future, how is this going to make an inclusive government or community? Inclusivity has been, unfortunately, defined in Afghanistan in a way to ensure that everybody who has been involved one way or another in the war with the guns, that they can have a share of the pie, which is again one of the reasons that we are seeing what we are seeing today. So inclusivity should definitely bring women at the center, and recognizing that they are half of the society, and ensure and condition the provision of aid to that, because other than that, I'm not sure what they will be getting. And then they should also try to adapt strategies that they would reach to the communities and basically curbing this idea of getting everything in a very centralized manner.
Yeah, I think that's really important to mention. And I did notice as well on Twitter that if you look at any of the videos, you do not see women walking on the streets. You don't see them included anywhere. So that's very sad and very concerning. I wanted to make sure we have time for Q&A. So I'm going to just transition over to there. So the first question that I have, and I think that this would be a good question for Hila. Hila, as Afghanistan continues to see a backsliding of freedom of speech and press, what do you think must be done to ensure that there is no cutoff in information and access?
Well, there has been already a shrinking space for civil society, for freedom of speech. I mean, the word democracy doesn't exist, but I'm also wondering, in the past 3 years of the Doha Agreement, how much our conditionality did work for the Taliban that now it would work. You see, even though the Doha Agreement was signed, how much did they stick to their promises of Doha Agreement that after this you can introduce conditionality and for them to respect freedom of speech or women's rights or human rights or whatever that they talk about in terms of rights of individuals under the Sharia, which changes at every moment, whoever is their spokesperson is. So this is one issue. The other issue is that from a power like the United States, which is leading in the world, you know, and democracy that it represents, with all sorts of checks and balances. In the past 3 years, there was no measures whatsoever to hold people who were doing the policies or making decisions on Afghanistan accountable. So now talking about women's rights, it's like it's easy for me to talk about women issues in Afghanistan being outside, but all those women who were a part of the women network or were on the ground right now are finding it difficult to survive. You know, so how can I just easily sit and say, you know, if we put conditions, then you can come out and talk and do these sort of things and then everything will be rosy. It doesn't work like that, because these people don't change. They haven't changed. They have a certain mindset and they'll continue to do that. So if we want freedom of speech, if we want, you know, some form of inclusivity of minorities, religious or ethnic, if we want women, you know, you need to ensure that that there is no Taliban at the large governing. You know, they can't. You cannot legitimize their rule under the gun, because that's what has happened before, and that if you do that again, we will have a new chapter of proxy war with ISIS in the you know, in the scene. There will be no such thing as women's rights or freedom of speech. Journalists are already writing. They are killing everybody that's open-minded, that stands for Afghanistan. So I'm afraid that I'm you know, drawing a very you know, a grim picture, but that's the reality of the situation. That if you really, your conditionality had worked, it would have worked in this 3 years. You must change your policy. You must hold those policymakers responsible and sit a stage at the global world, at the UN, to figure out how you're going to sort out your issues with China, with Russia, with regional countries like Pakistan, India, for us Afghans to live in peace. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a really good point. And Ambassador, I wanted to get your perspective on what Hila just said as well.
Well, on one hand, I agree with what she is saying in terms of the role of the region in resolving Afghanistan's issue. It hasn't been a full-fledged civil war necessarily the way it has been recently portrayed. But on the other hand, when we are speaking on conditionality, of course, the conditions of the Doha Agreement did not work, because nothing in Doha Agreement really worked. It was other than the specific timeline and deadline that was introduced and played along with, not much of that agreement and conditionality work. When we are talking about the conditionality, it is also a question of accountability. If you do not introduce a condition that if you don't see women in the public sphere, you are not going to provide aid, that should pressure. If you make the recognition of the government based on certain conditions, that how aid and support would be channeled, that would be something. But what is important is to stick with it, to respect it, to observe it, and not just to overlook it. So now that the whole issue in terms of the presence of troops and deadlines and all that is over, I'm hoping that this would be done in a more accountable way, because other than that, if you just provided aid and it never reached the communities, if it never reached the women, if it never reached the children, if it never reached the youth. So what are you really funding? And what other lever you have anyways to help? There is a huge humanitarian crisis boiling up, and that is important for the Taliban, who are claiming this victory, and they want to rule the country. I hope they want to rule a country that is not starving. And for that to be addressed, they would need international aid because of the shambled economy that we have. So I think this is the time that diplomacy must be put in place, and United States, along with the regional countries, along with the rest of the international allies and partners, must take a very closer look and make things work more for people and communities, because in the long run, even if their interest is as it is defined only a national security interest, that would be met by supporting these families and addressing the crises at that level.
Can I jump in here? I think this is important. Look, the Doha Agreement, and I've said this several times now, was an extremely weak agreement. It made very little demands of the Taliban, so there really were no conditions related to human rights or violence against Afghans. And every time the Taliban assassinated a civil society member, there were no consequences. There just weren't. And so I think that that is not a good example, because number one, there were hardly any conditionalities included in the Doha Agreement, and there were no consequences when the Taliban resumed violence and even assassinated civil society members. In fact, there were more concessions given to the Taliban. 5,000 of their Taliban prisoners were released. And this happened in the midst of them continuing violence. So, you know, that is a terrible blueprint to follow. And when I describe conditionality moving forward, it would be much, much different. And that's why I'm saying the US needs to work with international partners who believe in human rights and are willing to hold the Taliban accountable. Because I think that the way the Doha Agreement was negotiated was not the right way to proceed. And we're seeing that now. The US neither got a genuine peace agreement out of that, nor did it get anything on the terrorism issue. The agreement did not require the Taliban to break ties with al-Qaeda or expel al-Qaeda. So when I talk about conditionality moving forward with assistance, it would be a much different framework than we saw with the Doha Agreement.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I'm glad you brought that up. Conditionality is very important when you're moving forward. I'm going to ask one more question since I know we're running out of time, and it's kind of combining two questions that I saw. So with the Taliban back in power, I wanted to get from each of you what the US and even ordinary citizens in the United States and across the world can do to help the people in Afghanistan, or even those helping to resettle in different parts of the world. The United States, I know, is taking some refugees as well. And with that, how do you within Afghanistan, how do you make sure that aid is accessing the communities it's intended to serve, especially holding the Taliban accountable? And I'll go with, let me ask Ambassador Rahmani this first.
The biggest role that the international community and individuals, as well as the government, the lawmakers, everybody in the United States could do is not to abandon Afghanistan. Now that you don't really have troops on the ground, we should also ensure that there is one way or another access to what's happening there, for your own sake and for the sake of humanity, as well as the partnership that you have forged for so long with us, and of course, the people of Afghanistan. This is the first demand, because it is very easy to shift the focus on other crises, and the world is not short of different crises emerging and surfacing on a daily basis, and then forget about it, because this would have consequences for all of us. It is not resolving it. It is just passing it on at a bigger scale to the next generation, to the next administration. And we have seen this happen in the past. So the plea is here that let's not forget that there is millions of people that are in Afghanistan who has counted on you, who has partnered with you. And let's not forget that this population, which is so young, which is like a majority of them, over 65% are under the age of 25, meaning they don't even remember their country when you were not present. So they have this ties and alliance with you. And this was always an opportunity. Of course, an array of things did not go right, and we are where we are, but there is still opportunities for all of our sakes, for a better world, for ensuring that terrorism, extremism, drugs, radicalization, polarization, and all of this is not going to bubble up given the technological advancement and reaches, and for the partnership and alliance that we have made. There is still opportunities, and my request is let's make sure that you do not abandon Afghanistan. Once this dust settles and there is no more media attention, then you would forget about it. And then until there would, God forbid, would be another issue.
Yeah, Lisa, I'm aware of our time, but would you like to add anything as well, or Hila as well?
Yeah, I think Ambassador Rahmani summed it up well. We cannot afford to abandon Afghanistan. We did that in 1990, and it led to the path that led to 9/11. So, even for people who supported getting U.S. troops out, I hope they recognize how important it is for the U.S. to remain engaged in Afghanistan, not only because of the counterterrorism concerns, but also, the moral responsibility that we have to these people. We've been partnering with the Afghans for the last 20 years. We need to welcome with open arms the Afghan refugees coming to the United States. These are people we fought side by side for 20 years. We would not have been able to make the gains against al-qaeda that we made without the support of the Afghan security forces. And frankly, I think it was terrible when the president initially criticized the Afghan security forces and chided them, saying they weren't fighting for their country. I would like to inform him that over 60,000 Afghans died fighting for their country over the last 20 years. So that was simply a ludicrous statement. And I think, it's important, for people to write their congressional members, tell them they want to remain engaged with Afghanistan, support the Afghan people. Even without U.S. troops on the ground, we can continue to make a difference in the country.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Yeah, go ahead, Hila.
No, I just wanted to say that in my book, when I was analyzing the reconciliation process of Najibullah government, the similarity that I see between what's happening now and at the end of his government was the fact that the Russians decided not to support it, the government of Najibullah anymore, and actually try to bring back the Mujahideen that were close to them. In this case, it's the same thing where the Americans have decided the Taliban should come and somehow figure out the next steps. So my request to the international community is that as long as you do sort of support those that encourage radicalism or extremism. Not only your security is at risk, but the whole region's security is at risk. Second of all, please, for the Afghans who have been taken hostage, open your borders, because they need to get out. They want to get out. We saw not only what's happening at the airport of Kabul, but at the border cities of Pakistan and Afghanistan, how people want to leave. It's easy to say, let's not, let's go ahead and support the Taliban while we're outside. We cannot just say that we should just support them when we do not take into perspective what people are going through. So my plea to the international community is, people of Afghanistan should be first for you all, and make sure that you have your borders open, because they are the ones who are escaping extremism, just like I and Ambassador Rahmani did. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, Ambassador, and Hila for joining us today on such a really important topic that are on the minds of a lot of Americans and just really the international community in general. But that concludes our program today. This event will be available online in 24 hours. And you also should receive an email from our events team that will contain a short survey. And then attached is also a fact sheet that will include information on how to help with Afghan resettlement efforts in the United States. So I encourage you to check that all and see how you can help. And yeah, thank you all for participating today.